All right, why don't we get started here? So thank you
Sounds good.
so much for everyone who's attending this webinar. This webinar is called 10 Reasons Why Brands Are Embracing Podcasts. This is going to be a 45-minute presentation plus questions and answers. Throughout the 45 minutes, we're going to answer a bunch of questions for you, including what is a branded podcast, 10 reasons why your brand should be podcasting, how your brand can podcast, what type of brand is right for podcasting. We're going to talk about factors to consider when podcasting. We're going to round out then with a special offer for everyone who's attending today, and then answer any questions that anyone might have. So before we get started, we wanted to introduce ourselves. We are Jar Audio. Jar Audio uses podcasts to make meaningful connections between listeners and brands. So specifically, my name is Roger Nairn. I'm the CEO of Jar Audio. I've spent 18 years in the advertising world before entering the podcast space, working with really exciting storytelling-based brands, including Four Seasons, Netflix, Lamborghini, plus a whole bunch more. I've worked for big agencies and small. And then there's Paul Stewart.
Thanks, Roger. I'm Paul Stewart. I'm head of outreach for Jar Audio. I've been in sales and business development for 25 years. In the 90s, I worked in web, independent film. I spent about 10 years in the environmental movement with climate change. And the last 6 years, I've really been focusing back on technology and media.
So why should you listen to us? Jar Audio is one of the first to produce podcasts with brands. And we've been really lucky to work with some fantastic companies, including Lululemon, Expedia, Cineplex, Van City Credit Union, plus many, many more. But what we really get excited about is working with winning podcast strategies and executions, which is why we're so excited about getting started today. So let's get rolling. We wanted to start off with some definitions. Now, some of these high-level ones are probably familiar to everyone, but we want to just ensure that everyone understands, all the terms that we're going to be talking about today. So let's start out with what a podcast actually is. So there's some key elements when it comes to a podcast. It includes an episodic series that has spoken word, it is audio, and it is done in a digital manner. It involves niche topics, so it could be entertainment. So for example, comedy or drama, could be news, could be education, but there's so much more, which is why podcasting is such an incredible and exciting medium. Now, the format for what a podcast is shifting literally by the day. It started out very much mobile, but you're seeing more desktop and of course, smart speaker as well. It started out as audio only, but now you're seeing audio and video. And typically podcasting started out as a medium that you would download files. We're now seeing more examples of streaming, so Spotify being a good example. And podcasting was originally always a free medium, but we're seeing more and more examples of gated podcasts that include a subscription. What is a branded podcast? So a branded podcast is literally the exact same format as other podcasts, only it's owned and produced by the brand itself. So in a branded podcast, there is a thoughtful mention of the brand. However, the brand is not spread out throughout the content. The topic is tangential to the brand. So it could be something closely tied to the brand ethos. And it has to deliver a ton of value. It has to be useful to the listener. There has to be lots and lots of value. As such, branded podcasts are entertaining. They can be helpful. They can be educational. What is a branded podcast not? We're not talking about advertising on a podcast. That is definitely possible, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. It's also not just like a rotating podcast sponsorship. So for example, this episode of My Brother and Me is brought to you by Blue Apron. That's not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the brand being involved in producing the content itself and owning the actual show. So that brand owns the show. They become a broadcaster essentially. And yes, this is another form of content marketing, but it's really all about producing great branded entertainment. Some examples of brands pretty much run the full spectrum. You see some disruptor brands like Tesla, all the way to what we consider to be sort of older brands like General Electric. You see a lot of automotive brands. You see a lot in the tech space, services, software, but also brands like Expedia and some athletic brands like Under Armour. What we get excited about is that what's actually old is new again. When we talk about content marketing, a lot of this really started back in the, kind of the I don't want to say olden days, but long time ago when General Electric started with the General Electric Theater. Ronald Reagan was their announcer. Irish Soap and Procter & Gamble produced what we know today as the soap opera. And of course, the Michelin Guide was originally a guide produced by the Michelin Tire Company to get its customers out on the road and visiting all sorts of different restaurants. Now we know that today as the Michelin Guide. So when we think about, what that looks like today, companies like General Electric have produced podcasts like The Message. But what The Message isn't is it's not a show that has anything to do with medical devices or aircraft parts, products that General Electric produces. What it is, though, is a fictional sci-fi series about messages received from space. And so what they've done, and what gets us so excited, is they've created a brand halo, because General Electric is synonymous with invention and innovation. And so their branded podcast, is tangential to the brand. Another example is something that Jar Audio has produced. Out Travel the System is owned by Expedia, but what it's not is promoting a bunch of Expedia deals. Nobody wants to listen to that. Nobody wants to listen to a 30-minute ad, essentially. What it is, though, is delivering a ton of value by showing travelers a sneak peek behind the curtain of the travel world and arming them with insider tips, tricks, and hacks for how to get the best out of their travel. So again, we've created that brand halo effect because Expedia is a service built on its data and travel expertise. So what's, one of the things that's really important with a branded podcast is that we don't, yes, we do talk about the brand, but it's not scattered all throughout the content. Again, nobody wants to listen to a 20 to 30-minute advertisement. There's actually also rarely advertising run on the show itself. Keep in mind that, there is a bar that needs to be raised from a content perspective. So we have to deliver a ton of value because it is coming from a brand. We don't want to scatter it with a whole bunch of other advertisements. We want to really focus on delivering as much value and content to the listener. So what you came here for today is why are brands embracing podcasts? So we're going to dig in deep into 10 reasons and go into some detail.
Thanks, Roger. Let's start with the top 10. Number 1, podcast audiences are exploding. Right now, over 104 million people in the United States listen to podcasts. As a percentage, it's comparable in Canada. It has traditionally skewed younger. You can see age 12 to 34 and 35 to 54 there, but you'll see recently in the last year, it's actually increased for older people as well. Now, these stats are all from Edison Research's Infinite Dial reports. The one you're seeing on this page is from Infinite Dial Canada. There's also Infinite Dial US, and they do other countries as well that are listed there. Canada, which we also cover, we cover Canada and the United States. It should not be a surprise that they're mimicking the US and also have some of the world's highest listenership. It's being embraced by content studios, right? Just the enormity of the comms channel, the enormity of the audience has drawn New York Times famously, right? We're big fans. All of the large broadcasters, et cetera, all have content studios that are now engaging in branded podcasting. In a conversation with the New York Times not long ago, Adam mentioned in the next 3 years, all major brands will have a podcast. Number 2, podcasts allow you to reach new audiences. So let's dive into who the audience is. So they're educated. They're 45% more likely to have a college degree, 68% more likely to have a post-grad degree than the general population. They're affluent, 45% more likely to have a household income of $250,000. They're loyal to their brands. They're actually, and they're also okay with advertising. 46% of youth are okay with brands promoting products on podcasts. And 51% of biweekly listeners have made purchases based on hearing ads. Again, we are not, I'm not saying we're not negative ads or pro ads. I think from a branded podcast perspective, we don't see the need for an ad, but I just wanted to mention that ads and brand promotion is spurring purchases, obviously. Listeners have a tendency to spend more money on themselves. They drink more bottled water, juice, beer. I heard baby formula today. Next slide. They love to learn, right? 74% of users listen to podcasts to learn something new. They're heavy social media users. We should note, and this is where diving into the Edison reports is really quite fascinating, where they point out that Facebook and Twitter users are actually declining for youth, while podcasting in that category is on the rise. And they're influenced by word of mouth. This is a big one. Podcasts have high engagement levels. We see listen through rates, you can call it an engagement rate, of 90 to 95% of 20 to 25, sometimes 30-minute episodes on a weekly or biweekly basis. So this amount of engagement is incredible when you compare it to an average watch through rate on YouTube of 50% for, say, 1 minute. Yeah, so we believe that no other marketing channel has this high of an engagement rate. Next slide. But also with that engagement comes engagement value. You can see here, based on Westwood One, where do citizens and consumers see listening to a podcast? And it's really right after the news and weather. And actually, I see there it's tied for music, but above videos and shows. Okay, so let's talk about ROI. So podcasts give great ROI. We know from our conversations every day with marketing professionals that there is some confusion around how to measure content marketing ROI. So you can use the traditional financial approach, of course, just like any marketing medium, right? Where ROI equals net profit over the cost of investment times 100. I think that it's important to note, though, that it's important to measure the ROI of the content success overall. So on the next slide, you'll see you can measure ROI a number of different ways. Measure your ROI on brand metrics. Is your awareness going up? Authority, consideration, purchase intent. Web metrics. Are they leading to new leads? Is it increasing site traffic? Is the podcast helping with conversions and SEO? Podcast metrics, right? What are your listens and downloads? Or more importantly, what are your engagement metrics? How long are people listening on a weekly, bi-weekly basis? And reviews. So not all ROI is created equal. So it very much depends on your goals for the project. We've done a lot of research in podcast ROI, and we have a lot of assets on our website, on our blog, et cetera, focused on ROI. I think this is a key one as well. Podcasts are an intimate medium. So as a medium, podcasts have thrived because they're able to deliver the one thing that the internet and other mediums haven't really been good at, which is intimacy. So let's think about this. Your brand is literally in the ear of of consumers and citizens, right? It is literally like a whisper. It's catered to their personal preference. It's mostly solo on your own time. So it's the brand and the individual one-on-one. Podcasts are portable. We know that people are multitasking as they're listening. So they're in the car, they're on the bus or the subway, they're at the beach, they're walking the dog at the gym. They're not walking the dog at the gym, but they're walking the dog, at the gym. Washing dishes is my personal favorite. It's my personal time. Mowing the lawn, grocery shopping, working. BBC Audio did a study called Activated, which is quite fascinating. The link is there. So 94% of listeners consume podcasts while performing other tasks. So this mode of listening actually elevates the engagement with the brand.
And I think that's quite unique, given other marketing mediums out there, to say that the level of engagement actually increases when people are busy. There's not many others that are able to make that claim.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I can watch a YouTube video while I do the dishes, which I do sometimes, but mostly I'm listening.
But is your brain actually retaining anything?
Right. No, exactly. So what the study found was that two processes occur in order to deliver this, right? Keeping the brain occupied enhances the ability for brand messages to achieve cut through. So the activity means that the podcast content is being taken in through what's called low involvement processing, which is a much more fuel efficient process that has a lower cognitive load. As such, engagement with the content can last much longer. It's like when I go for my jog, which is usually say 45 minutes, I can usually get in 1 or 1.5 podcasts rather pleasantly during that time and learn something.
Your jog is 45 minutes. Mine is 4 to 5 minutes.
Podcasts are a pull medium. And what this means is that listeners subscribe to the content. They actively seek it out. So every morning on my podcast app, like they literally pop up, and I'm excited about certain ones. But I actively seek out more. I notice the Zoom window is always over top of what I'm talking about. I'll remove that. So avid listeners invest their time. So a number of people listen to them monthly, and then a voracious amount of people listen to them weekly. And the weekly people, of which I would include myself, listen to an average of 6.5 hours of podcasts every week. And I would say that would be on the low end for me. Now, I do listen to a lot of news, but my point is that the weekly listeners do listen to a lot. And I think the stat in Edison Research was that they listen to 5 to 7 different podcasts a week.
So again, if we tie things back to the engagement rate of branded podcasts, when we're talking about a 20 to 30 minute episode, that's a lot of content being broadcast from the brand, and that's a lot of time spent, mm-hmm. Between the listener and that brand.
Mm-hmm. Number 8, they're also great for internal communications. I'm not sure if you've considered this as agencies or brands, but they're actually quite popular. So obviously an internal podcast is a podcast produced by an organization. It's privately distributed. It's a direct link, or you can put it on your intranet, and you can actually measure the engagement, of course, as to how many people have listened and actually who's listened. The reason these are popular is because it's a great break from screen fatigue, particularly during the pandemic. Emails and intranets go unread. Plus, I find they're really one-dimensional, particularly from a corporate comms perspective. They're delivered in a format that the staff can embrace on their own time. Again, they can decide to go for a jog and listen to your senior leadership team speak to them, for example. Great for culture building, onboarding, development, particularly leadership development. And they're delivered in a conversational style with human voice and intimacy. Number 9, they're a flexible medium. So they're not constrained by time. I mean, what's Joe Rogan now, 2-3 hours? We like 20 to 30 minutes, given average commute times in North America, but they can be shorter, they can be longer, right? The format, we'll talk about format in a minute, but is it interview? Is it documentary? Is it fictional? It's not constrained by ad standards, not constrained by topic. And when we think about the volumes, I don't think we talk about this in this webinar, Roger. I'll just mention it quickly. There's I think 1.2 million, I heard 1.25 podcasts out there now versus 31 million YouTube channels. So there's still so much room in terms of storytelling, and the shelf life, the long tail is there for sure. Podcasts have continued through the pandemic. So in terms of listenership, audiences still want to be entertained. They want a new skill or escape, of course. We did see the numbers dip slightly. I think it was like 5 to 6% or something in March. And then by May, we were back up to 10% increase in listeners over pre-COVID. So the hockey stick keeps going. And I should just mention that the recording of these interviews or documentary style, it's all done remotely, without any sacrifice in quality. We have a proprietary recording system, which we ship out to our guests, and we ensure that we're the highest quality possible. So we continue to be open for business as normal.
So, we want to talk about how your brand can be podcasting, or you might be from an agency and might have some clients that are interested in podcasting. We wanted to give a bit of an overview on how it's possible. So, It's really all about delivering as much value as possible. And the way to do that is to really dig down deep and understand who that listener is. So understanding what they need, what they care about, also what they listen to. And then ask yourself as a brand, like what is it that we can deliver? What could we teach somebody? How can we help? How can we entertain? You know, right now there's a lot of Americans, a lot of people around the world who are struggling to find new jobs. So, you know, unfortunately, there's a lot of unemployed. You know, there's going to be a drastic shift in people needing to reskill themselves. People needing to learn new tasks or new skills. You know, there's absolutely a place for a brand to play that role in teaching them. So what can you teach? How can you help? You know, where can a brand provide as much either education or it could be providing reassurance. How can they help these people? But also, how can you entertain? You know, people still need to laugh. People still need to disconnect from the craziness of the world out there and be entertained. And again, brands can play that role. It also takes the right type of brand. That brand needs to have a certain point of view, a perspective on a certain issue, or maybe a certain paradigm shift that's needing to be taking place. They need to, of course, have a lot of creative bravery. You know, the more they're able to lean in on certain topics, the more they're able to, you know, explode beyond the boundaries of just like, you know, really tight corporate comms, the better. And again, deliver as much value as possible. That has to be the rally cry of the podcast team as you're producing your show. And of course, quality. Quality is absolutely vital. You need to lean in and produce a highly well-produced show that is packed full of value. You need to choose the right host. Now, sometimes that host can be internally from the brand. Our recommendation is to look outside of the brand first to hire a host. A couple of reasons. One is they're able to lend just a different perspective. They're not as, you know, they're not as inside the walls of the, you know, the company and the brand. That being said, if somebody from the brand is a great talker, as we would call them, and is able to give a great interview and obviously understands a certain issue better than anyone, absolutely that person can come from within your organization. You want to apply the right music. That could be either custom or it could be stock. Music is a fantastic tool for an episode because it actually helps carry the listener on. It also sets certain tones. It shifts the focus of an episode in some cases, or gets people to focus. And because these are all marketing, you know, because these podcast episodes are marketing mediums, we have certain tools that, you know, certain ways of using music and sound effects to shift people's attention and also to keep people moving along, you know, just from an attention standpoint, which is where we get that great long engagement rate. Multiple scenes also do the same thing. Shifting multiple scenes sort of wakes the brain up as the episode's being listened to, and keeps people engaged and interested in the episode. And then, of course, telling a well-crafted story always keeps people interested, always keeps people entertained, and it's absolutely vital to a great podcast. So how do you produce a great podcast? Paul's going to take it from here.
Rookie year. We recommend a 4P framework for any brand that's considering producing a new podcast. Produce, push, pull, and promote. So from a production perspective, we encourage brands to think about audience first. So there's no question brands think about customers, but we're trying to encourage brands to act like broadcasters and consider audience first. Any agency, any production company that is working on podcasting should be doing upfront strategy workshops.
I think you could also, you know, bring your team together internally and have a workshop where everyone is brought to the table.
And there you're going to be talking about strategy. You're going to be talking about what is your guest strategy, what is your season arc, and what is the story format. So there's three primary formats that we see. The most prevalent, of course, is interview-based, with sculpted question lines that really get under the hood of an issue. That's probably, I don't know, 90% of all podcasts out there. And then there's narrated. That's something you might hear on NPR or CBC on the weekends. It's a script and clip documentary style podcast where the narrator takes you on a journey. And then far less prevalent, but I think one of the most exciting formats right now is fiction or science fiction, where the sky's the limit. You could hire actors and tell futuristic stories. You can do whatever you like, really. Obviously, any resources that you are working with to produce should be doing research, writing the question lines, scouting, hiring the host, recording, adding stock or custom music, doing sound editing, and then hosting and distribution. So depending on the format, typically in podcasting, a season is considered 6 episodes. It should take, with the front end workshops, et cetera, it should take about 1 to 2 months to produce the first 2, maybe 3 episodes, which you can put in the bank, so to speak. And then what you can do is start releasing them each episode every 1 to 2 weeks. Monthly is less effective in terms of audience building, so probably want to start doing it every 1 to 2 weeks. So if you consider that sort of timetable, the amount of time that's actually involved from the client or brand perspective, we've calculated at about 6 days of work over this total 4 to 5 month period. So in terms of capacity, it's not a ton of effort, basically. Push. You know, in talking to brands every day, we do know that there's a lot of concern about how difficult it is to distribute a podcast. And here I'm talking about distribution, not promotion. That's separate. But the distribution is actually quite simple. We recommend signing up for a dependable online podcast server to push the show and its episodes out to the podcast world. We happen to use Omni Studio. And it literally, you upload them, you push them, and they go to Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Overcast, etc. It's literally just done for you. The podcast server also gives you access to analytics, which is important. Reviews, the listener reviews. It gives you an embedded player if you also want to, during your promotion, put it on landing pages and social, and then social links, of course.
So one of the great things that Paul just mentioned is when you're using an online server to push your show out to the world, that same server is pulling in all sorts of data, and data is so important to a podcast. It pulls in that data and allows you to interpret the data to make recommendations on how to improve the performance of the show, and all that data is real time. So these programs allow you to see the downloads, how many people are listening to the show, how many have subscribed to the show, in other words, how many people are saying, I love this and I want to receive it every time it's pushed out. You're able to see the reach. You're able to, again, look at all those reviews. You're able to see the demographics and also the geographics. We can actually tell right down to the city where people are listening all around the world. One of the really cool things too is we're able to see all of the consumption. This is actually the detail around episode to episode. How are people interacting with those episodes? We're able to see verified plays, the average time. So we had mentioned that, we see roughly 90 to 95% of an entire episode listened to. We're able to see the retention level, also where they start an episode. Most start at the very, very beginning, but really important to us is where are they dropping off? Where is it perhaps not as interesting of content, a bit boring. Maybe there's a type of guest that is turning people off and they're dropping off. Or maybe there's a certain segment in the show that we thought was a great idea. Turns out it's not. As well, we can see where people are skipping. We're able to tell maybe there's a section that, we've done on a recurring basis, but people find it to be not as much value to them, so they're moving on. That's all important data to us. So we're able to tell that information and then pass it on to our creative teams. And same would be for yourself. If you're producing a podcast internally, understanding what needs to be done, relay that to your team and produce the next episodes based on that information. And of course, we want to be able to promote the podcast. So it's very, very important. Longer the days where, if you built it, they would come. It used to be that you put a podcast on the internet and it would just fly around and go viral and all that sort of stuff. Paul mentioned there's 1.2 million podcasts live right now. You do need to put some effort into promoting your podcast. And we look at podcast promotion from 5 key buckets, and we think it's very important that you do so as well. The first is marketing. This is where you look for partnership opportunities, different media companies that perhaps are making lists that you're able to pitch them on to include this show, different social platforms, things like that. The second is PR and earned media. This is where you're putting together a bit of a media package and actually pitching the media on why they should be writing about your show. Anytime you're doing something like this, you're going to want to put an outreach plan, timelines together for your entire team, so everyone's able to see what's going on, but also amplify it. The next is what we call spotlight. So there's a big misconception when it comes to when a show is featured at the top of Apple Podcasts, for example. A lot of people think that it's based on, gaming, an algorithm of some sorts. The reality is that when it comes to Apple Podcasts and Spotify and some of these other directories, it's all based on an editorial decision. So there's actually editors at Apple Podcasts, different categories of editors who are making decisions on which podcast should be featured. Now, it could be because it's very popular and they want to be able to amplify that, but you can actually pitch them as well on why you think your podcast should be featured. Now, it might be that there's a certain time of year and your podcast is just perfect for that. Maybe it's Christmas and your podcast is all, has some sort of a Christmas angle to it, and they should feature that with other Christmas-based podcasts. Or maybe you have a certain topic that you're speaking about. Recently a lot of podcasts, on the Black Lives Matter movement have been featured. So it's really just a matter of finding that right angle, pitching them, and in a lot of cases can be quite successful. That does a huge thing for listenership as well. So another box that we look at is cross promotion. So when we think of podcasts and we think of the audience, one of the sort of low-hanging fruits is other podcast listeners. So we suggest doing the research on what are some of the other shows that your listeners would be listening to, and then approach those shows. The podcast world is incredibly friendly and is quite small. So you can literally reach out to these podcasts and work out a deal where you're cross-promoting each other. Now, that could mean that you bring the host of their show onto your show and you interview them, vice versa. Or it could also mean that maybe you do a content swap where you take one of their episodes and include it in your feed as a bit of a bonus episode or a surprise episode. Really, like Paul mentioned, there are no rules to this. So it's just a matter of your creativity and what you think makes the most sense. You also want to look at paid opportunities. So, strategically placed ads, advertising in the right channels to increase exposure, paid social, for example. The sky's the limit again on what makes the most sense. It's all based on what makes the most sense for your show. We also do look at just kind of outside the box thinking on other areas that make sense to increase your listenership. So maybe, your brand has a really strong email list, or, maybe you're a nonprofit and you've got a strong list of volunteers. We always recommend, encouraging staff to download the show. We have a client who held what they call subscribe and sip parties, where they got all the staff together for a wine and cheese party, and they talked about the podcast and they played the podcast and encouraged everybody to subscribe to it. Again, what are some of the sort of unfair advantages that your brand is able to leverage to increase that listenership? And of course, you don't want to forget to design your podcast ecosystem. And when I talk about the ecosystem, I'm talking about things like the artwork, the landing page or microsite. You want to drive traffic to perhaps provide more information on a certain episode. You want to think about the social content. You ideally want everything to kind of look the same and feel within the same family. So how's that social content going to look? What's it going to sound like? What is the language? And what are the different formats that you need to consider? And then social links. Every episode, obviously you're going to want to share it. There are different ways of receiving and using social links. Our recommendation is a program called, which is done through Chartable. Chartable is a great service that charts some of the top podcasts, but also allows you to chart your own podcast as well. They have a service called Smart Links, and when you use a Smart Link to promote your podcast, it automatically opens up. So if a user receives that link, it automatically opens up into their favorite podcast directory that they use. So let's say they love using the Overcast app. They click on that link and it automatically opens up the Overcast app. Great thing about that is it's just a super simple user journey, and we want to get people as quickly into the podcast itself so that they can subscribe. So highly recommend using Smart Links. Just a couple examples of sort of look and feels of different types of shows. And again, you want to create a website, some sort of a landing page where people can learn more information. This is an example from Hackable, which is done through McAfee. Fantastic example. And just a few other considerations. We're talking about using the podcast as a marketing medium itself. You can, of course, advertise on podcasts. So when you're considering that, there are two sort of types of podcast advertising. The first is what we would call baked in. This is where the ad is part of the podcast content and lives in the content for the life of the podcast. Has its advantages, definitely has its disadvantages. One of the disadvantages is that once that ad is in that content, it's pretty much there forever, meaning you can't really change it. Typically, it's also sort of a lot of times read by the host, which you can lack a little bit of control there as well. And so we recommend dynamic ad insertion. That's where the ad is actually served through a donut in whatever podcast that you're buying into, and so that allows you to change up the content of the ad. It allows you to target more specifically age, demographic, sex, geography, and then it allows the ad to swap out. It runs exactly like your programmatic advertising. So we wanted to just kind of quickly give a little bit more information on Jar Audio as we're wrapping up here. So Jar Audio is a creative studio, and we use podcasts and other long form audio to make meaningful connections between people and brands. From a leadership team standpoint, we come to the table with an impressive list of experience. Each of us has either worked in building brands or producing engaging digital content or telling compelling stories. But then we have a huge team behind us of creative professionals. They include writers, recordists, sound editors, and audience growth strategists that know how to hold attention, shake you to your core, and make you feel the feels. Our sort of secret is journalistic integrity blended with audio expertise. We are able to offer all the services that we talked about today, full service. We are also able to scale dependent on the different needs of the project. We also love working with agencies, and we know that some agencies have some certain capabilities that we also cover. So we also love to mix and match our specialties with each other. And we've worked with some fantastic brands. These are just a few of them, but really we love working with brands that tell great stories, are not afraid to expand the walls of their creativity and really deliver a ton of value to their communities.
Thanks, Roger. So as Roger just mentioned, we're a full service agency, but our services are scalable. I think before we talk about what's needed to move forward, I think it's important to talk about cost. As I mentioned before, a podcast series is considered 6 episodes. Often brands will order 6 and then they'll renew for another 6 and another 6, et cetera, on and on. Sometimes they will pivot along the way. They might experiment with 6. They might launch 6 on their own. The way that the podcast industry is priced is based on per delivered minute. So on average, Jar Audio charges $400 per minute. So if you do the math, 6 episodes times 20 minutes times $400 works out to about $48,000. There are suppliers who charge much, much more. And there are, and then not below Jar, but in other areas of the market, there's freelance, which could charge less. I think the challenge with freelance is you're not really getting a team. And obviously with a Cogealed team, we've had the opportunity to do this many times. Cost is scalable, right? So you could do 7-minute episodes. You could do 1-hour episodes. You could do 3 episodes times 60 minutes. You could do, 12 episodes times 15 minutes. It's really up to the project and what the creative requires. As we mentioned, it takes on average about 4 months to complete that 6-episode series. And typically we start with just a 30-minute call. If there was questions and answers, obviously we'll talk about Q&A now, but I mean in the future, if there was questions and answers that you had that you wanted to chat about, or if you wanted to chat about specific projects, or where we get really excited is if you want to, at no charge, work with us on some ideation around some thought starters. Maybe internal to your marketing department, you want to do some ideation around some new ideas based on some of your brand pillars and campaigns that are coming up, or whether you're an agency and you have some brands in mind that you think would be interested. We're happy to spend the time, either myself alone, or we can have Roger and our creative director, Jen Moss, join us on the call. So my information is there. I'm excited to talk to you in the future. So please drop me a line.
Before we got into the Q&A, we had a special offer that we wanted to give to everyone. This is the first step for you on the journey of discovering Branded Podcasts. But one of the things that we want to share is as much additional information as possible to you. So we've created a site that allows you to view the vital podcast statistics that all brands should learn about. It's pretty much the most comprehensive collection of American and Canadian statistics around the podcast listener. We've taken data from a whole range of different research firms around North America and consolidated that into a really simple site that you can view. So when we share the deck from today and we share access to the video, we will also include that link in that email, which you'll all be receiving. But before we go, we wanted to see if anybody had any questions at all. If you did have any questions, please just drop them into the Q&A section of the Zoom. We'd be happy to answer them. I don't see any in there. Do you see any, Paul?
No, I don't see any now, but of course, the offer is always out there. You can always drop us a line if you wanted to chat or even just have an email exchange. I am paul@jaraudio.com.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Wish you the best rest of the day. Thank you so much. Good luck and happy podcasting.
Thanks for your time. Be well, everybody.
Bye-bye.